Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a wrap-up of science fiction and fantasy. And this time around, I am focusing on bigger books. It's one of my New Year's resolutions is to try to read more books over 500 pages. And especially as a booktuber, there's a lot of pressure to put out a certain quantity of review videos and so forth. But I decided that I really want to focus on going through some of the larger books while I do have a lot of reading time and just take advantage of that. And so I have some really chunky books to talk about here and a lot of chunky books on my TBR. So if you have any recommendations for chunky sci-fi books you would love to see me read in this coming year, please let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, I have some great recommendations for you all, so let's get started. First, let's talk about science fiction, and I read XX by Rian Hughes, and this is a book that I definitely would not have picked up if I hadn't have set a goal to focus on bigger books because it's really chunky. It's, I believe, over 900 pages, and this is a multimedia science fiction novel. It is a standalone, and the general premise is that at the beginning of the story, humans potentially receive information or contact from a alien life, and then the story involves them trying to figure out what to do with it, how to get more information, and how to go from there. And I am being a little bit vague on purpose because this is a really unique form of first contact. We are not getting green aliens coming down on a rooftop. Instead, they receive a signal or a form of communication that is very subtle. And we particularly follow one young man who appears to be perhaps neurodiverse, and within the story, he is very OCD in his behavior and possibly has aspects of autism. And within the story, we follow him, and he's just a little bit eccentric, but at the same time, he is also brilliant. And he comes up with theories about how the aliens are possibly communicating with them. And the story just unravels into this amazing concept. And I don't want to spoil what actually transpires, but it's a very intellectual science fiction novel. It's very unique. And particularly, it is multimedia focused, which I know for a lot of you is going to be really exciting because I know a lot of you, of course, love books in the vein of Night Film and House of Leaves. So if you're looking for something like that, this is one to pick up. I held on to the library book copy just so I could give you an idea. And within the story, there are pages with these big blocks of text. You get things like this. I don't want to spoil too much, but there is so much woven throughout the story. Now, I will admit that I probably do not love multimedia stories as much as other readers. If I'm honest, my favorite parts of the story were the parts that read as a traditional novel because I more want to know the story than to have to cipher through the various little pieces and graphics, etc. But they really did fit the story, so they weren't out of place because it really ties into the communication with the aliens. And I thought it was really creative, really imaginative. And the author himself, I understand, is someone who has a background in graphic design and typography. And so he takes his own education and brings it into the story. So it was very, very well done. And if I had a criticism of this book, it's just the fact that I found it to be a little bit exhaustive by the end. For me, I would have loved it a little bit more if it had been shorter, more condensed. And again, it's just the fact that I don't think I love multimedia stories as much as I think I do. I thought the concept was brilliant, but the actual reading experience just got a little bit tiring. And again, this is the same thing I would say about reading House of Leaves for myself. But if you love that experience, I really think you should check out this book. It's so unique. It is so smart. And again, just really intellectual, the places that it goes. It's not your typical first contact story and was really a lot of fun. So hopefully I can put this one on a few people's radar. Again, it is a really chunky book, but I will say that it does read reasonably fast because not all the pages are traditional written text. And so there are times you're flipping through several pages very quickly and able to move on with the story in a faster pace than you might think. So definitely please check it out for yourself. It's a really fun one. Next, for a shorter book, I read Little Fuzzies by H. Beam Piper, and this is about a man who works as a surveyor for a business. When he's on a planet, he discovers this group of creatures that appear to be highly intelligent, and he goes about trying to protect them because, of course, the business he works for wants to destroy their habitat. And this is one I picked up, I will admit, because I read the story Fuzzy Nation by John Scalzi, which was inspired by this book, and I really enjoyed John Scalzi's work, so I was always interested to read the original additional inspiration. And I will be talking about this book in comparison to that one only because of the reading order in which I picked these books up. But of course, I acknowledge that this is the original work and have a lot of respect for the author who came up with the story first, because I was really surprised how similar the stories were. John Scalzi definitely goes beat for beat through a lot of the major aspects of the story. And what John Scalzi does is bring a lot more humor to the story. There's a little bit of humor in this one, but it's definitely toned down and it's more of a straightforward story. Again, themes of conservation, environmentalism, and, you know, protecting our creatures and so forth. And I did think the story was very good. It was very engaging and it was very short. So it's a very short and sweet story where you will just fly through the pages. In my case, I actually did the audiobook, which is available through the Audible Plus catalog, which I currently have advantage to read. And so I read it that way and just, yeah, found it very enjoyable. I will admit that I do prefer Fuzzy Nation only because I enjoy the humor so much more. But again, I'm really grateful that I got a chance to read the original work. And even though it is an older book, it absolutely holds up to modern reading. And I really think that people should check it out, especially if they're fans of John Scalzi's story. It's great to see where it all began. And speaking of John Scalzi, I also read the Interdependency trilogy over Christmas. And the first book, of course, is The Collapsing Empire. This takes place in a future where light speed travel does not exist, at least not in the traditional way. Instead, what they have found are these roadways that they call the flow that allow ships to move very quickly through certain parts of space. And because of that, humans have colonized various places throughout the galaxy where there are planets close by the flow network. And this, of course, allows for trade. However, at the beginning of the story, you find out that the flow, the way that everyone is able to travel within this galaxy, is slowly starting to collapse. And because of that, the planets are eventually going to be cut off from each other and will be required to be self-sustaining in order to survive. The story is primarily told from the perspective of the ruling body. They are both kind of the ruling emperors of this future and also control all of the business and economics of this future. And so I will say that while this book has an element of action, in a lot of ways it's much more politically focused. So it's a lot of political intrigue, a lot of people sitting in rooms discussing what is going to happen, discussing what has happened, learning about the past and, you know, predicting what is going to take place in the future. So I will say that it's a little bit drier than some of John Scalzi's other books. I like the idea of it, and I did enjoy the books for the most part, although I will say I like the first book the most, and I like the second book a little bit more than the third, which I found to be a bit disappointing. The first book is the only one I did on Audible, which is narrated by Will Wheaton, and I do wonder if his performance really helped to uplift that first story, and that's why I liked it the most, or if the story in general was just stronger. But I do recommend this one to John Scalzi's fans. I don't think it's his best work, so personally I would recommend starting with something else like Lock-In or Old Man's War if you've never read him before, but this was definitely still an enjoyable one and a series I was glad to get through. From there, I went on to read the 7 books in the Saga of the Seven Sons by J. Anderson series, the first book being The Hidden Empire. And this was a bit of my Christmas project. This is the series I picked up after finishing The Expanse, and I was looking for another science fiction story that would just be very escapist and help me to move on from the giant reading slump and hole that Leviathan Falls left in my heart. And I will say that this book definitely worked in terms of escapism, but it wasn't actually as good as I thought it would be. And considering how much time I invested into reading all 7 books, I was pretty underwhelmed by the finale. So without spoiling anything, this is a story that is told over multiple points of view. It's set in a future where there are different factions of humans, and we interact with another alien race that exists within our galaxy. Right at the beginning of the story, humans discover some technology that is from another ancient race, which is believed to have died off. And that technology changes everything and just awakens this larger story. I don't want to spoil a lot, so I'll just kind of keep it, again, a little bit vague. But this is a story that's told over multiple points of view, as in many characters, not just 2 or 3. And it spans this whole epic story, but it never really builds towards anything. Like, it has moments, but the way the story is told, it doesn't have a lot of good payoff, if I'm honest. And I will say that I never found the characters to be very interesting. They just kind of read as flat and kind of stereotypes. And the writing itself wasn't really strong. The dialogue wasn't really strong. But I kept reading. Every time I finished a book, it would end on kind of a cliffhanger and I wanted to know what was going to happen next. And there was like some epic things that were happening in the story. It just didn't leave the best impression on me. So I gave all these books like 3.5 stars, but I kept reading. So take that for what it is. I don't think it's the best science fiction series I've ever read, but I did read it all. So again, take that for what you will and decide for yourself if you want to check it out. Next, I want to mention that I've received a copy of The Alien Stars by Tim Pratt. This is from Angry Robot Books, and this is a collection of 3 novellas that are set in the Axiom trilogy universe. And if you're not familiar, that is a trilogy of books I've talked about several times on my channel that starts with The Wrong Stars. And this is a queer, diverse space opera series that I always recommend for beginners because it's really easy to get into. It follows a lot of the space opera trope, so it's not necessarily very original, but again, for someone who is newer to the genre, it's a really great stepping off point. It's full of humor and adventure and action and a little bit of romance. It kind of has a little bit of everything, and the books themselves are quite short. But I want to mention that, of course, I'm talking about this, which is a collection of novellas, 3 specifically, that are set in the universe. You do have to read the original trilogy first before you get into this one, but it's great if you want to spend more time in the world. And at each story, we get to follow one character. The characters are ones that you will definitely want to spend more time with, and I like that these stories kind of play with themes involving artificial intelligence and some other fun ideas there. So they were enjoyable, but your level of interest in this collection is very much going to depend on your level of interest in the book. So if you finish the trilogy and just want more, this is where you want to go from there. Next, I read Cryptonomicon by Neal Stephenson. I hope I said that right, and I promised you some big books in this wrap-up, so here we go. This is a story that is so hard to describe. It's set over 2 different timelines, one being during World War II in the 1940s, and then one being the present day at that time. And the story just involves codes and math and so many different concepts, and I love the hard science in this book. You can tell that Neal Stephenson has such a background in these fields and loves them. And the beginning started off really strong for me. I was really interested in the characters, the story, and the concepts being described, and I was really enjoying it until I got to the point that I wanted the book to be done, and I still had about half the book to go. It is a really, really long book. My copy was over 1,200 pages, and I was really struggling to get through the second half. And I do think that this is going to be a problem with Neal Stephenson for me because I tend to really like his ideas, I like his writing, but I do have a preference for shorter books, which might make you wonder why the heck I'm trying to do a challenge to read bigger books, but I'm trying to push myself out of my comfort zone. And I think my problem is that I like everything he's doing, but I wish that he was edited down because in my opinion there was more than was necessary in this book, and it would have been a stronger story if it had been shorter. So reluctantly, I was not able to give this the 5-star treatment that I wanted to. It ended up being about a 3.5 stars for me, at least on this first read through. But again, I liked it a lot. I will continue to read Neal Stephenson and definitely will consider returning back to this book, just probably not anytime soon. Now, switching over to fantasy, I might as well keep talking about Neal Stephenson because I also picked up a copy of The Rise and Fall of D.O.D.O by, of course, Neal Stephenson. And this is more fantasy, which I didn't initially realize, but ended up being a lot of fun. It is set in our current time for the most part, but it is a story involving a society that is trying to find out what happened to magic. Years ago, magic supposedly existed, but no longer does. And so they end up traveling back in time, getting connected with witches and trying to figure out what happened. And this book is just a lot of fun. It is so different than the other Neal Stephenson books I've read, and I should mention that it is co-authored by Nicole, Galland, and maybe that's why is that she brings in a lot of good humor. But it's a story that, while it is fantasy, definitely incorporates scientific ideas. So there's some great discussions involving quantum mechanics and things like that, and I love those geeky moments. This one is just entertaining and enjoyable and goofy and snarky, and just, yeah, the amount of humor in the story was great. I normally don't like funny books, but this humor really worked for me, and overall I enjoyed it. But if I have to admit, I got to a point where I think I had about 200 pages left in the book, and I was ready for it to be done. I enjoyed it, but I was ready for it to be done because I didn't feel like it was adding anything more. And so again, I think I would have really, really loved this one had it been a little bit shorter. It's only 700 and some pages, but if it had been 500 pages, I think I would have loved it. But I just got, again, fatigued by the end and just felt like it was a little bit too bloated. So overall, I would recommend this one. I thought it was really fun and really creative. And again, I'm open to rereading it at some point because I do see it as a story I can kind of revisit again in the future and just hopefully get even more out of it the second time around. Next is a review copy, and that is The Starless Crown by James Rollins. This is one that I received from Tor Books, and this was one of my most highly anticipated releases for 2022. This book got so much buzz online, and I was incredibly grateful to receive a review copy. This is a story that's told from multiple points of view. The primary one that we follow at the beginning is a young woman attending a sort of magic school. She is virtually blind. She can see images, but her sight is very much blackened out. And at the beginning of the story, she makes some predictions about orbital mechanics, things that she shouldn't know, and gets pulled into this larger story. She has to go on the run. There are other characters that she meets along the way. And it's very much a page turner of a story, which is not surprising given the author. But I will say I didn't love it as much as I would have liked to. So I will say that I really enjoyed the beginning of the story, which involves a discussion of orbital mechanics, because if you don't know, I love when fantasy stories incorporate science fiction into them. It's something that I just love to see, and when it's done well, it can just be really enjoyable. But what I struggled with was the characters, because this is a very character-based story, and I found the characters to just be a little bit flat and unforgettable. And it's a very large book too, and so you spend a lot of time with characters, which again, if you're not invested in their story, it makes it hard to be invested in the larger world, etc. And I will also admit that I found his prose to be quite weak, given the fact that this is a very edited story. I assume it's just his writing style, and compared to a lot of fantasy books I've read, it just didn't really do a lot for me. And I did end up switching partially to the audiobook, which I got through NetGalley, which helped a little bit just because there's less of a focus on the prose when it's being told to me. But this one was just okay. It wasn't bad. I did not hate it, but I struggled to stay invested in the story. I struggled to pay attention when I was listening to the audiobook. And again, it was a book that I just wanted to be done before it was, and had to push myself through to finish it, which I really hate to say, because again, I was so excited for this book and it just ended up being very average. But if you're interested in a fantasy story that explores some scientific ideas, it does have some creative moments. I did appreciate some things it was doing. And of course, you can always try it for yourself, but for me, it just didn't completely come together in the end. And finally, I just want to briefly mention that I read The Veiled Throne by Ken Liu. This is the third book in the Dandelion Dynasty series. This is an epic fantasy inspired by ancient Chinese culture. I have been loving it. It ended up on my best fantasy published in 2021, and the fourth and final book is supposed to come out early this year, so you're definitely going to hear about this series again. I will say that I enjoyed this one, but the plot is getting a little bit meandering, so I kind of need to know where the story is headed. But I was really surprised that there was a huge element of food and cooking in this one, which personally I actually really enjoyed. I don't want to spoil how it gets incorporated into the story, but if that sounds good, definitely recommend trying it for yourself. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know if you're planning on checking out any of the books I mentioned here. I'd also love for you to recommend me your favorite science fiction books over 500 pages, or fantasy, that's all right too. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of these genres as well as horror and thrillers, so I hope you stick around and hit subscribe. You can help me out also by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, that always helps me out. And if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.